What if I told you 9 US presidents never attended college at all, and one of them couldn't spell committee? Abraham Lincoln read by candlelight in a dirt floor cabin. Woodrow Wilson had a PhD from Johns Hopkins. Harry Truman never finished a 4-year degree. In 1779, Thomas Jefferson drafted the University of Virginia charter calling education the most legitimate engine of government, then watched the office pass to men who'd never opened a textbook. If you're into forgotten American contradictions, hit subscribe. This gets darker. Get comfortable. Pour something warm. Settle in for the night. By 1913, when Woodrow Wilson entered the White House, American presidential credentials had reached their intellectual peak, and it would never happen again. Wilson wasn't just college educated. He held a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University, earned in 1886 with a dissertation on congressional government that academics still cite. He'd been a professor, then president of Princeton. His opponents called him the schoolmaster. His supporters called him a visionary. The reality sat somewhere between those labels, in faculty meeting rooms where Wilson had learned that authority and intelligence don't always align. He'd restructured Princeton's curriculum, fought with wealthy donors, lost bitter academic battles that taught him how power actually moved through institutions. The PhD gave him credibility, but the faculty politics gave him edge. Wilson's education shaped his presidency in ways both obvious and strange. He wrote his own speeches, unusual for the era, filling them with historical references and moral philosophy that sounded impressive but often obscured practical realities. When he presented his 14 points to Congress in January 1918, he was performing what he'd learned in lecture halls: how to make complexity sound simple, how to dress preference in principle. His academic training taught him to believe in rational persuasion, which worked beautifully in faculty senate but failed spectacularly at Versailles. The other world leaders, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, Orlando, weren't impressed by philosophical arguments. They wanted territory, reparations, revenge. Wilson's education had prepared him to win debates, not negotiate with men who'd sent millions to die in trenches. The irony settles in when you look at Wilson's actual academic record. His grades at Princeton were mediocre. He struggled with mathematics and showed little interest in subjects outside history and political theory. At Johns Hopkins, he avoided the hard sciences entirely, focusing on institutional governance, how power moved on paper, not in practice. His dissertation argued that Congress, not the president, dominated American government. Then, he became president and spent 8 years proving himself wrong, expanding executive power beyond what the founders had imagined. It's the kind of contradiction that makes you wonder whether formal education teaches you how things work, or just gives you confidence to ignore how things actually work. Wilson's academic career had another legacy that rarely appears in textbooks. As Princeton's president, he defended the university's segregation policies, arguing that integration would disrupt institutional harmony. As U.S. president, he segregated federal agencies that had been integrated since Reconstruction. The PhD taught him systematic thinking. He applied it to systematizing racism. Education gave him intellectual tools. What he built with those tools revealed that credentials measure capacity, not character. After his stroke in 1919, Wilson's wife Edith essentially ran the executive branch for 17 months, screening all access to the invalid president. The most educated president in American history ended his term as a hidden invalid while his wife made decisions his doctorate couldn't help him make. Academic training prepares you for many things, but not for watching your body betray you while your wife forges your signature on documents. By 1993, when Bill Clinton took office, presidential credentials had inflated dramatically. But Clinton's resume stood out even in an era of mandatory Ivy League degrees. Georgetown for undergraduate work, where he studied international affairs and worked for Senator Fulbright. Then a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, the first president since Wilson to study abroad formally, though Clinton never completed a degree there, caught between political science coursework and Vietnam War draft anxiety. Finally, Yale Law School, where he met Hillary Rodham in the library and learned that credentials opened doors but charm kept them open. On paper, Clinton was the most internationally educated president in history. In practice, his education taught him how to navigate elite spaces while maintaining his Arkansas accent, a trick that served him better than any seminar. Clinton's educational pedigree gave him fluency in policy detail that impressed wonks and bored voters. He could discuss healthcare reform for 3 hours without notes, cite specific provisions in trade agreements, explain the mechanisms of financial regulation with genuine enthusiasm. The Georgetown training in international relations shaped his approach to foreign policy, multilateral, diplomatic, built on institutional frameworks rather than military force. When critics attacked him during the 1992 campaign for avoiding the Vietnam draft while at Oxford, his education became a liability. He learned about war in libraries while others died in jungles. The Rhodes Scholarship, designed to create international leaders, marked him as someone who'd chosen books over bullets. Yale Law School taught Clinton something more useful than constitutional theory: how to assemble a network. His classmates became federal judges, corporate lawyers, political operatives. When he needed legal advice, policy expertise, or campaign strategy, he called people he'd studied with in New Haven. The education created the infrastructure. Hillary's Yale Law credentials added another layer. 2 attorneys who'd learned the same legal frameworks, who could discuss policy implications in shorthand, who understood how to translate between academic theory and political reality. When Clinton faced impeachment in 1998, his legal education helped him parse the difference between criminal wrongdoing and impeachable offenses, a distinction that saved his presidency but destroyed his reputation. The contradiction embedded in Clinton's educational achievement reveals itself in his presidential library's archives. Hours of recorded interviews where he discusses third-way politics, triangulation strategy, the intellectual frameworks that guided his administration. Then FBI records of his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, where his legal training helped him argue what his means. The Georgetown degree taught him international diplomacy. He used it to broker peace in Northern Ireland. The Oxford Scholarship taught him classical political philosophy. He used it to justify welfare reform that abandoned democratic principles. The Yale Law degree taught him constitutional interpretation. He used it to survive impeachment while admitting inappropriate conduct. Education gave him sophisticated tools. He used them for both statecraft and survival, often in the same week. By 2009, when Barack Obama entered office, credential inflation had reached its logical conclusion. Every serious presidential candidate needed not just a college degree but a graduate degree, preferably from an Ivy League school. Obama checked every box. Columbia University for undergraduate work, though his time there remains somewhat mysterious. He kept few friends from that era, didn't participate in campus politics, described himself as a monk focusing on studies. Then Harvard Law School, where he became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review, a position that launched him into public visibility. The credentials weren't just impressive, they were historic. They signaled intellectual achievement in institutions that had long excluded people who looked like him. Obama's Columbia years shaped his political philosophy in ways he rarely discusses publicly. He arrived from Occidental College in Los Angeles, a transfer student finding his footing among East Coast elites. He studied political science and international relations, reading deeply in critical theory, post-colonial literature, and constitutional law. His senior thesis on Soviet nuclear disarmament has never been released. Columbia claims no copy exists, leaving a gap in the documentary record that feeds conspiracy theories, but probably just indicates that undergraduate work rarely merits preservation. What matters is that Columbia gave him theoretical frameworks for understanding power, how it operates, who holds it, who's excluded from it. When he became president, those frameworks shaped policies from healthcare to foreign intervention, though political reality forced compromises that theory never prepared him for. Harvard Law Review changed Obama's trajectory entirely. The position is elected by fellow law students, a political campaign within a school that trains lawyers, not politicians. Obama won by building coalitions between conservative and liberal students, promising to give both factions space in the review's pages. It was the first time he demonstrated the post-partisan appeal that would carry him to the presidency, and the last time it would work so cleanly. The review presidency led to a book contract, the memoir Dreams from My Father, which sold modestly until his 2004 Senate campaign turned it into a bestseller. The Harvard credential opened publishing doors. His writing ability kept them open. The gap between Obama's educational achievement and his presidential effectiveness reveals something uncomfortable about credential worship. He'd studied constitutional law, taught it at the University of Chicago, understood its frameworks better than almost anyone who'd held the office. Then he took office during a financial crisis, facing a hostile Congress that refused to acknowledge his legitimacy regardless of his Harvard degree. The education gave him analytical tools to understand policy, but it couldn't make Republicans vote for his legislation. When he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, partly for his educational background and intellectual approach to foreign policy, he was 8 months into a presidency that would include drone strikes, continued Guantanamo detention, and military operations in 7 countries. The Harvard Law Review president became the constitutional lawyer who expanded executive power beyond what his scholarship had argued was constitutional. It's exactly the kind of contradiction his legal training should have helped him avoid. By 1789, when the office first existed, Thomas Jefferson had assembled an education that wasn't measured in degrees, but in sheer intellectual range. He'd attended the College of William and Mary for 2 years, studying mathematics, philosophy, and metaphysics under Professor William Small, who introduced him to Enlightenment thought. He never graduated. The college didn't award degrees in any formal sense, but the education stuck. He learned Greek, Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish, read constantly, collected one of the largest private libraries in America, over 6,000 volumes covering law, science, philosophy, agriculture, and architecture. When the Library of Congress burned in the War of 1812, Jefferson sold his collection to replace it, a transaction that essentially meant the federal government bought Jefferson's brain, preserved in bound paper. Jefferson's self-education continued long past his formal schooling. He studied law under George Wythe, Virginia's most respected legal mind, reading through Wythe's library while apprenticing in Williamsburg. By the time he passed the Virginia bar in 1767, he'd absorbed English common law, Roman civil law, and colonial legal precedent. His legal training shaped his political thinking. Laws were human constructions, changeable, improvable, perfectible through reason. That belief drove him to draft the Declaration of Independence, Virginia's religious freedom statute, and the plan for the University of Virginia, which he considered among his greatest achievements. The man who never earned a college degree designed a university that rejected religious instruction and emphasized science, architecture, and classical languages. Essentially, an institution that would produce students like himself. The contradiction in Jefferson's educational legacy sits uncomfortably in Charlottesville today. He founded the University of Virginia in 1819, calling it an academical village where students and professors would live together, learning through dialogue rather than lectures. He designed the buildings himself, modeling them on classical architecture he'd studied in books and seen in Europe. The rotunda, modeled on Rome's Pantheon, symbolized Enlightenment reason. Knowledge is sacred. Meanwhile, enslaved workers built the buildings, lived in the basement rooms, and served the students who discussed liberty in the classrooms above them. Jefferson's education taught him classical philosophy, architectural proportion, and Enlightenment ideals. It didn't teach him, or perhaps it did, and he ignored it, that enslaving people contradicted everything those ideals meant. Jefferson's self-taught expertise extended to bizarre corners. He calculated that English might evolve into separate languages over millennia, designed an improved moldboard plow, documented Native American languages before they disappeared, maintained detailed weather records, and bred experimental crops at Monticello. His education was almost pathologically broad, driven by curiosity that couldn't distinguish between essential knowledge and trivia. When he served as president, this intellectual range sometimes helped. His French fluency aided diplomacy. His scientific curiosity made him receptive to Lewis and Clark's expedition plans, and sometimes created problems. He spent hours designing the University of Virginia's curriculum, while his Treasury Secretary handled the actual business of government. The education made him believe he could understand anything if he read enough, a confidence that occasionally blinded him to his limitations. The man who'd never managed anything larger than a plantation thought he could redesign American government through philosophical reasoning. By 1826, when John Adams died, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence was signed, his educational pedigree had been both his launching pad and his burden. Adams graduated from Harvard in 1755, at a time when fewer than 1% of colonial men attended college. He'd studied classical languages, theology, rhetoric, and natural philosophy, the standard curriculum designed to produce ministers. Adams chose law instead, apprenticing with a Worcester attorney before opening his own practice in Boston. The Harvard degree gave him credibility with colonial elites, but his actual education came from arguing cases in provincial courts, learning how power moved through legal procedures, understanding that law could be both weapon and shield depending on who held it. Adams's education shaped his presidency in ways that seemed obvious to him and mystifying to everyone else. He believed in institutions, in procedures, in the civilizing force of law. When France threatened war in 1798, Adams' legal training made him resistant to calls for immediate military action. He sent diplomats instead, believing negotiation could achieve what violence couldn't. The cessez-faire, French demands for bribes before negotiation, humiliated those diplomats and made Adams look naive. His education taught him that rational men would choose peace over war. Reality taught him that rational men often prefer war because it's profitable. The Harvard degree hadn't prepared him for that lesson. His wife Abigail, who'd never attended school but educated herself through voracious reading, understood political reality better than his formal training had taught him. The gap between Adams' education and his political effectiveness showed most clearly in the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Adams had studied constitutional law, understood the First Amendment's protections, knew that criminalizing criticism of government violated the principles he'd fought for during the Revolution. He signed the acts anyway, under pressure from Federalist allies who argued that wartime required controlling dissent. His education taught him the principles. Political survival taught him to abandon them. When Thomas Jefferson defeated him in the 1800 election, partly by mobilizing opposition to those acts, Adams spent his retirement writing bitter letters about how ungrateful Americans were for his sacrifice. The Harvard education taught him many things, but not how to lose gracefully. Adams' legacy includes his insistence on education's importance for democratic governance. He argued that public schools were essential for maintaining Republican government, that ignorant citizens couldn't make informed choices, that education was infrastructure as important as roads or ports. He said this while watching his own educated son, John Quincy, prepare for Harvard. The Adams family advantage, wealth, connections, access to the best education available, created a dynasty. John Adams' education gave him entry to power. John Quincy Adams' education made him assume power was his birthright. The gap between democratic ideals and aristocratic reality sits in that contradiction. Education was supposed to level society. Instead, it created hierarchies that mimicked the British class system Adams had fought to escape. By 1825, when John Quincy Adams became president after one of the most controversial elections in American history, his educational credentials were unmatched. Harvard graduate like his father, then diplomatic training across Europe while still a teenager, learning languages and statecraft while most young men learned farming. He'd studied at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, attended diplomatic functions in Paris and St. Petersburg, served as his father's secretary during treaty negotiations. When he entered Harvard in 1786, he was already more educated than his professors in practical diplomacy. The college taught him Greek and Latin. Europe taught him how empires actually functioned. John Quincy Adams's education created a peculiar problem. He knew too much and trusted too little. His diplomatic training taught him that every negotiation involved hidden motivations, that apparent allies often worked against you, that treaties were temporary arrangements until circumstances changed. This served him brilliantly as Secretary of State, where he negotiated the Adams-Onnes Treaty, securing Florida and defining the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. As president, that same suspicion made him paranoid and ineffective. He saw conspiracies everywhere, in Congress, in his cabinet, among voters who'd supported Andrew Jackson in the disputed 1824 election. His education taught him complexity. Political leadership required projecting simple confidence. He couldn't fake it. The contradiction in John Quincy Adams' educational achievement shows in his post-presidential career. After losing to Jackson in 1828, he did something unprecedented, ran for Congress, and won, serving 17 years as a representative from Massachusetts. In Congress, his education finally found proper use. He could cite classical precedent, quote international law, cross-reference constitutional history. When he fought against the gag rule that prevented congressional discussion of slavery petitions, he used his rhetorical training to tie procedural arguments to moral ones. His education made him the most qualified person in the chamber and the most annoying to his colleagues. They called him Old Man Eloquent, a compliment that carried an insult. He was eloquent because he'd had advantages they hadn't, and he never let them forget it. Adams' diary, maintained from 1781 until his death in 1848, reveals the psychological cost of elite education. He recorded daily self-criticism, measured himself against classical standards, agonized over wasted time. His education taught him that great men studied constantly, improved themselves relentlessly, served public good selflessly. The reality of politics, compromise, manipulation, appealing to voters' fears rather than their reason, disgusted him. He spent his presidency proposing ambitious national projects, a national university, astronomical observatories, a national system of roads and canals. Congress ignored most of it. His education taught him what was possible. Democracy taught him what was popular. Those weren't the same thing. By 1837, when Martin Van Buren took office, the educational requirements for president had shifted dramatically. Van Buren never attended college. He grew up in Kinderhook, New York, son of a tavern keeper, speaking Dutch as his first language. His formal education consisted of a village academy and then a legal apprenticeship with a local attorney. He learned law by reading Blackstone's commentaries and observing court procedures, the traditional path for lawyers without means for university study. This made him instantly different from the previous presidents, Washington aside, who'd all had access to formal higher education. Van Buren's education was practical, local, democratic in the most literal sense, available to anyone willing to work for it. Van Buren's apprenticeship-based legal training shaped his political style in ways Harvard could never have taught. He learned that law wasn't about abstract principles, but about knowing judges, understanding local politics, building relationships that could swing cases. By the time he opened his own practice in 1803, he'd mastered the informal networks that actually ran New York politics. He joined the Democratic-Republican Party, became a state senator, then New York Attorney General, building the Albany Regency, a political machine that controlled state patronage through precise organization and ruthless efficiency. His lack of formal education became an asset. He wasn't burdened with theories about how politics should work, so he focused on how it actually worked. As president, Van Buren's practical education served him poorly during the Panic of 1837. Banks failed, unemployment soared. Bread riots erupted in New York. Van Buren's response followed the limited government principles he'd learned as an apprentice lawyer. The federal government shouldn't interfere in economic matters. His education taught him that law set boundaries but didn't solve problems. Voters wanted solutions, not boundaries. When he proposed an independent treasury system to separate federal funds from private banks, it was intellectually sound and politically unpopular. A Harvard education might have given him economic theory to justify intervention. His apprenticeship training left him with only precedent, and precedent said do nothing. The cost of Van Buren's limited formal education shows in his single-term presidency. He couldn't compete with the classical allusions and rhetorical flourishes that educated men used to signal authority. His speeches were workmanlike, clear, logical, boring. He looked like what he was, a skilled political operator without the cultural polish that voters associated with leadership. When William Henry Harrison defeated him in 1840, running as Old Tippecanoe with log cabin imagery, it marked the complete reversal of educational prestige. Van Buren, the self-made lawyer, lost to Harrison, the college dropout and military hero. The office was changing again. Formal education mattered less than projected authenticity, even if that authenticity was theater. Van Buren's practical legal training had taught him how to win in Albany. It hadn't taught him how to perform democracy for a national audience. By 2001, when George W. Bush took office after the Supreme Court halted the Florida recount, presidential credentials had reached a strange zenith. Bush held both a Yale undergraduate degree and a Harvard MBA, making him the first president with a Master of Business Administration. On paper, this was the most technically qualified president for managing the executive branch as an organization. Yale had given him the liberal arts foundation and family connections that opened elite doors. Harvard Business School had given him management theory, financial analysis skills, and the credential that legitimized his oil industry career in Texas. The education screamed competence. The presidency would raise questions about what that education actually measured. Bush's Yale years tell you more about inherited privilege than educational achievement. He graduated in 1968 with a C average. Admitted through the combination of family legacy, his father had been a Yale baseball captain, and prep school credentials from Phillips Academy Andover. He joined Skull and Bones, the secret society that connected elite families across generations. Essentially a continuing education and maintaining class power disguised as fraternity. Yale taught him who mattered, who didn't, and how to signal membership in the ruling class through subtle cues. When he later claimed to be a regular Texan who cleared brush on his ranch, the Yale degree sat in the background. A reminder that regular Texans don't have Ivy League credentials and Secret Service details. The Harvard MBA added a different layer to Bush's educational resume. He attended from 1973 to 1975, during the post-Watergate period, when business education emphasized ethical leadership and corporate responsibility. The curriculum included organizational behavior, financial management, strategic planning, exactly the toolkit needed to run a large organization like the federal government. Bush learned case study method, analyzing business decisions and their consequences. When he became president, his administration applied that management approach, focus on quarterly results, delegate to trusted executives, frame political decisions as strategic choices. September 11th interrupted that plan. Bush's education becomes darkest when you examine the Iraq War decision process. Harvard Business School taught him about cost-benefit analysis, risk assessment, strategic planning. Those tools should have raised red flags about invading Iraq based on disputed intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. The educational training was there: how to evaluate evidence, how to pressure test assumptions, how to identify when subordinates tell you what you want to hear rather than what you need to know. Bush received those tools at two of the world's most prestigious universities. He either didn't use them or used them to justify a decision already made. The education gave him credibility when he addressed the nation about Iraq, but it didn't prevent the strategic disaster that followed. The contradiction embedded in Bush's Ivy plus UMBA credential shows in his post-presidential reputation. His administration's failures, Iraq, Hurricane Katrina response, the 2008 financial crisis, didn't stem from lack of educational preparation. Yale taught him institutional analysis. Harvard taught him organizational management. The education was there. What was missing? Judgment, curiosity, willingness to question authority figures, can't be taught in seminars. Bush's educational achievements opened doors that his capabilities arguably didn't merit. He's proof that credentials and competence can diverge spectacularly, that the right degrees from the right schools measure access and persistence more than aptitude or wisdom. The Yale diploma and Harvard MBA gave him authority to make decisions. They didn't give him the wisdom to make good ones. By 2009, when Joe Biden took the vice presidency under Obama, his educational credentials told a straightforward story. University of Delaware for undergraduate work, then Syracuse University College of Law, graduating in 1968. It wasn't Ivy League pedigree, but it was solid professional training, the kind that dominated 20th century American politics. Biden studied history and political science at Delaware, the classic preparation for law school and public service. Syracuse gave him the legal framework he'd used throughout his Senate career, chairing the Judiciary Committee and navigating constitutional questions about everything from Supreme Court nominations to criminal justice reform. Biden's law school experience included a controversy that shaped how he approached education questions for the rest of his career. During his first year at Syracuse, he received an F in a legal methods course after citing 5 pages from a Fordham Law Review article without proper attribution. Biden claimed it was an oversight, that he'd been unfamiliar with citation standards. The professor viewed it as plagiarism. The incident was resolved. Biden retook the course, properly cited his sources, but it created a permanent asterisk next to his law degree. When he ran for president in 1987 and again in 2019, opponents raised the Syracuse incident as evidence of character flaws. Biden's educational credentials were standard for his generation. The citation failure became the story, proof that credentials without precision meant nothing. As vice president and later president, Biden's education shaped his approach to foreign policy in ways his Syracuse professors probably never anticipated. He'd studied constitutional law, understanding the balance between executive power and congressional authority. As chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he'd applied that knowledge to debates about military authorization, arguing that Congress needed to vote before committing troops. As vice president, he pushed back against military intervention in Libya and expanding operations in Afghanistan, using constitutional arguments about separation of powers. His Syracuse training gave him the framework. Decades of political experience taught him when those arguments would be ignored. The education provided tools. The Senate taught him that tools don't matter when the president has already decided. Biden's relationship to education shifted dramatically when his son Beau died of brain cancer in 2015. Beau had followed his father's path, University of Pennsylvania for undergrad, Syracuse Law for his JD, creating a family tradition that emphasized accessible but solid education, not elite credentials. Beau's death occurred while Joe Biden was still vice president, contemplating a 2016 presidential run. He chose not to run, later saying the grief was too overwhelming. When he did run in 2019, his campaign emphasized his connection to ordinary Americans, his Scranton roots, his state school education. The Delaware and Syracuse degrees became assets, proof he wasn't part of the Harvard-Yale elite that increasingly dominated both parties. His education was good enough to demonstrate competence, but not so elite that he couldn't claim working-class authenticity. The gap between Biden's educational credentials and his political longevity reveals something interesting about how credentials function in American politics. He wasn't the smartest senator. Colleagues would tell you that. His Syracuse law degree didn't make him a constitutional scholar like Obama. His undergraduate history degree didn't make him an intellectual like Wilson. What his education gave him was legitimacy, the entry credential that allowed him to be taken seriously. Once he had that, personality and political skill carried him forward. By the time he became president at 78, his education mattered mainly as background noise, a box checked decades earlier. What voters evaluated was judgment, empathy, experience, qualities his Delaware and Syracuse degrees signaled but didn't create. The education was necessary but not sufficient, a recurring pattern in American presidential history. By 1977, when Jimmy Carter took office, he brought credentials that represented a different path to power: the United States Naval Academy. Carter graduated from Annapolis in 1946, 59th, in a class of 820 midshipmen, a respectable but not exceptional finish. The academy wasn't traditional college. It combined engineering education with military training, producing officers who could lead sailors and understand nuclear physics. Carter studied engineering, and after Annapolis, he pursued nuclear engineering training under Admiral Hyman Rickover, joining the submarine service during the early Cold War when nuclear propulsion was transforming naval warfare. This was technical education at the highest level, but it was narrow, focused preparation for a specific career rather than broad intellectual development. Carter's Naval Academy training shaped his presidency in ways that often hurt him politically. Engineers solve problems through systematic analysis, data collection, careful planning. Carter applied that approach to everything: energy policy, Middle East peace negotiations, federal budget planning. He famously micromanaged White House operations, even scheduling access to the tennis courts personally. His Naval Academy discipline made him believe that if he worked hard enough, studied the details thoroughly enough, made decisions based on sound analysis, success would follow. Politics doesn't work that way. Congress didn't care about his careful analysis of energy policy. Voters didn't reward his mastery of policy details. The education that made him an excellent submarine officer made him an ineffective politician. The contradiction in Carter's educational background shows most clearly in his post-presidential career. After losing to Reagan in 1980, Carter used his engineering problem-solving approach for humanitarian work, building houses with Habitat for Humanity, negotiating peace agreements, monitoring elections, eradicating diseases. These projects suited his educational training perfectly: concrete problems, measurable outcomes, technical solutions. His Naval Academy education taught him how to build things, fix things, optimize systems. As president, he tried to apply those skills to political problems that couldn't be solved through engineering. As a former president, he found problems that could. The education was always there, it just needed the right context. Carter's relationship with his Annapolis credentials evolved over time. During the 1976 campaign, his military education played well. Voters saw discipline, service, technical competence. The nuclear engineering training made him credible on energy policy and national security. But the Academy's limitations became clear in office. He'd been trained to make decisions based on best available information, then commit fully to the chosen course. Politics required flexibility, the ability to shift when circumstances changed, to compromise when necessary. His engineering education taught him there were right answers and wrong answers. His presidency taught him that in politics, there are only choices with different consequences, none of them wholly right or wrong. By 1974, when Gerald Ford became president after Nixon's resignation, his educational credentials represented a perfect middle ground: University of Michigan for undergraduate work, Yale Law School for his law degree. Ford played football at Michigan, center and linebacker, on national championship teams in 1932 and 33, before graduating in 1935 with a degree in economics. Yale Law was where he proved his academic seriousness, graduating in 1941 in the top third of his class. The combination worked: state school athletic hero plus Ivy League legal training, accessible but impressive, regular guy with elite credentials. Ford's Michigan years shaped his political identity more than his Yale Law degree ever did. He'd grown up in Grand Rapids, worked his way through school, understood middle-class anxieties because he'd lived them. The football career gave him physical toughness and team discipline, qualities that translated well to political leadership. When he later served in Congress representing Grand Rapids for 25 years, His Michigan roots mattered more than his Yale degree. He was Jerry Ford, the football player from Michigan who happened to go to Yale, not Gerald Ford, the Yale-educated lawyer who happened to be from Michigan. The education provided credentials, Michigan provided authenticity. Ford's Yale law education became relevant in August 1974 when he pardoned Richard Nixon. The decision was legally sound. Presidents have constitutional pardon power, but politically catastrophic. Ford's law school training taught him that the pardon would end the Watergate crisis quickly, allowing the country to move forward. He was technically right. The pardon did end Watergate's legal phase, but his education hadn't prepared him for the political fury that followed. Voters saw the pardon as corruption, proof that Washington elites protected each other. Ford's approval ratings collapsed. His Yale degree gave him the legal framework to justify the pardon. It didn't give him the political instinct to anticipate the consequences. The gap between Ford's educational credentials and his presidential effectiveness reveals how narrow legal training can be. Yale law taught him constitutional law, statutory interpretation, legal reasoning. It didn't teach him how to navigate congressional opposition, how to manage economic stagflation, how to win re-election after inheriting a presidency during a constitutional crisis. When he lost to Carter in 1976, it marked the defeat of competent establishment credentials by outsider energy. Ford's Michigan plus Yale background was impressive, but voters in 1976 wanted change, not impressive credentials. His education was never in question. His judgment was. The Yale degree proved he could master legal theory. His presidency proved that mastering theory and executing leadership were different skills, taught in different places, often incompatible. By 1969, when Richard Nixon entered office after one of the most remarkable political comebacks in American history, his educational credentials told a story of ambition overcoming modest origins. Nixon attended Whittier College in California, a small Quaker school where he excelled academically, graduating in 1934. Then Duke Law School, which had offered him a full scholarship as part of its effort to build reputation by recruiting top students from across the country. Nixon graduated third in his class in 1937, proof that his legal mind was sharp, even if his undergraduate pedigree wasn't Ivy League. The education gave him the tools, his resentments gave him the motivation. Nixon's Duke Law experience shaped his presidency's darkest moments. He'd studied constitutional law and understood executive power's theoretical limits, knew exactly what presidents could and couldn't do legally. When the Watergate scandal unraveled, what shocked legal scholars wasn't that Nixon broke laws. Presidents had done that before, but that he understood so precisely which laws he was breaking. The Duke education taught him where constitutional boundaries lay. He chose to cross them anyway, believing that presidential authority justified actions that his legal training told him were impeachable. His education made the crimes worse because it removed the excuse of ignorance. He knew better. His law degree proved it. The contradiction embedded in Nixon's educational achievement shows in the White House tapes. Hours of recordings where Nixon discusses legal strategy with advisors, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of executive privilege, attorney-client privilege, the Fifth Amendment. His Duke Law training comes through clearly. He knows constitutional doctrine, understands how courts would likely rule, plans strategies based on legal analysis. Then he orders the same actions anyway. Believing political necessity overrides legal constraint. The education gave him the vocabulary to describe his crimes precisely. When he famously told David Frost, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal," He was articulating a theory of executive power that contradicted everything Duke Law School had taught him about constitutional limits. His education didn't prevent his abuses, it gave him tools to rationalize them. In Nixon's relationship with his Whittier plus Duke credentials reflected lifelong class resentment. He wasn't born into privilege like the Kennedys or Roosevelts. His father ran a grocery store. He worked his way through Whittier, through Duke, through every stage of his career. The education was his ticket to power, but he never forgot that he'd needed a ticket while others were born with access. That resentment drove his political career, defeating the establishment that looked down on his California roots, his Quaker college degree, his lack of family connections. When he was forced to resign in August 1974, it was the ultimate defeat by the establishment he'd fought his entire life. His education had given him the credentials to reach the presidency. It couldn't protect him from the consequences of abusing it. By the mid-19th century, when formal legal education remained optional and apprenticeship dominated the profession, the presidency became accessible to men who'd never seen the inside of a college classroom. Millard Fillmore embodied this pathway completely. Born in a log cabin in the Finger Lakes region of New York in 1800, Fillmore received almost no formal schooling as a child. His family was too poor, the nearest school too distant. At 14, he was apprenticed to a clothmaker, learning to full cloth while teaching himself to read using borrowed books. At 19, he bought his release from the apprenticeship and enrolled in an academy for a few months, his only formal education beyond childhood basics. Then he apprenticed with a local attorney, reading law while clerking, the traditional path for lawyers without means for university study. Fillmore's legal apprenticeship taught him procedure, precedent, and politics, the practical tools that formal education often missed. By 1823, he'd been admitted to the New York bar and opened his own practice in East Aurora. His lack of college education became an asset in local politics, proof that he'd risen through merit rather than privilege. He served in the New York Assembly, then Congress, presenting himself as a self-made man who understood ordinary citizens' concerns. When he became vice president in 1849, and then president after Zachary Taylor's death in July 1850, his educational background mattered less than his political connections. The Compromise of 1850, which he supported, required political calculation, not classical learning. His apprenticeship training taught him how to read the room, how to count votes, how to broker deals. It didn't teach him that some compromises postpone problems rather than solve them. The absence of formal education limited Fillmore's presidential effectiveness in ways that became clear during his single term. He had no framework for understanding the constitutional crisis building around slavery, no historical perspective from classical study, no philosophical grounding from college coursework. His legal training taught him to respect precedent, so he enforced the Fugitive Slave Act because the law required it, even as it destroyed his political support in the North. A broader education might have given him tools to see beyond the immediate legal question to the larger moral crisis. His apprenticeship taught him how law worked in practice. It didn't teach him when following law's letter violated its spirit. Fillmore's post-presidential life revealed the cultural costs of his limited education. He knew he lacked the polish of college-educated presidents, so he spent years trying to acquire it retroactively. He traveled to Europe, visited universities, collected honorary degrees, and built a personal library in Buffalo. In 1856, he ran for president again on the Know-Nothing ticket, an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic party that appealed to nativism and resentment, ironic for a self-made man who'd benefited from America's promise of opportunity, regardless of birth. His lack of formal education had taught him self-reliance, but also insecurity. He'd reached the presidency through practical skills, but he never stopped feeling inadequate compared to the college men who'd been trained to lead. The apprenticeship gave him a career. It didn't give him confidence that the career was enough. By 1853, when Franklin Pierce entered office, educational credentials had stratified into recognizable tiers, and Pierce occupied the middle ground. He had attended Bowdoin College in Maine, graduating in 1824 alongside Nathaniel Hawthorne, who became a lifelong friend. Bowdoin wasn't Harvard or Yale, but it was respectable, a liberal arts education that included classical languages, rhetoric, mathematics, and moral philosophy. Pierce studied law afterward, the standard path for ambitious college graduates, and was admitted to the New Hampshire bar in 1827. His education gave him social polish and professional credentials, enough to signal he belonged in political leadership, but not so elite that ordinary voters resented him. And Pierce's Bowdoin education shaped his political worldview in ways that destroyed his presidency. The college emphasized moral philosophy rooted in Protestant theology, teaching that compromise and moderation were virtues, that extremism on any side threatened social order. Pierce absorbed this completely. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act came before Congress in 1854, Pierce supported it, believing that allowing territories to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty was reasonable compromise. His education taught him that reasonable men could disagree civilly. Kansas taught him that some disagreements end in violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers turned Kansas into a war zone. Bleeding Kansas, where the democratic process became murder and arson. Pierce's moderate college training had prepared him for gentlemanly debate, not guerrilla warfare over human bondage. The gap between Pierce's educational preparation and presidential reality shows in his drinking. He'd struggled with alcohol before the presidency. His wife Jane was deeply opposed to his political career, partly because of his drinking, but it worsened in office. Bowdoin had taught him classical history, where leaders faced dilemmas with stoic courage. His presidency taught him that courage wasn't enough when your education hadn't prepared you to understand that slavery wasn't a question for moderate compromise. The college degree gave him vocabulary to discuss constitutional theory. It didn't give him moral clarity to see that some issues required choosing sides, not splitting differences. Sure, when Democrats refused to renominate him in 1856, he became the only elected president denied his party's nomination for a second term, proof that his educational credentials hadn't translated to leadership capability. Pierce spent his post-presidential years in obscurity, drinking heavily, defending his Kansas-Nebraska position, even as the country descended into civil war. His Bowdoin education had taught him history, but he learned the wrong lessons, that compromise always works, that moderation always prevails, that gentlemanly education creates gentlemanly politics. The Civil War proved those lessons catastrophically wrong. His college degree signaled his eligibility for leadership. It didn't prepare him to lead during a crisis that required moral conviction rather than educated moderation. The education was real. The preparation was illusory. By 1857, when James Buchanan took office, educational credentials had become more standardized, and Buchanan's resume looked impressive for his era. He'd graduated from Dickinson College in Pennsylvania in 1809, studying classics and law. Dickinson was a small liberal arts college, not elite by Boston standards, but solid and Presbyterian serious in its approach to education. Buchanan then studied law through apprenticeship, was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1812, and built a successful legal practice before entering politics. His education gave him exactly what ambitious young men needed: classical training for respectability, plus legal skills for career advancement. Buchanan's Dickinson education shaped his presidency's greatest failure, his passive response to secession. He'd studied constitutional law, understood federalism's theoretical limits on federal power, believed in strict construction of constitutional text. When South Carolina seceded in December 1860, Buchanan argued that while secession was illegal, the federal government had no constitutional authority to prevent it by force. His education taught him to find answers in legal documents. The Constitution didn't explicitly address secession, so Buchanan treated it as a question without legal remedy. A broader education in political philosophy might have taught him that constitutional crises require leadership beyond textual interpretation. His legal training made him see a complicated legal question where Lincoln would see a simple moral imperative: preserve the Union. The contradiction in Buchanan's educational background reveals itself in his diplomatic career before the presidency. As minister to Russia and later minister to Great Britain, his classical education served him well. He could reference European history, understand dynastic politics, navigate aristocratic social protocols. When he returned to domestic politics, that same education made him passive. He'd learned how empires fell, gradually through institutional decay, with leaders unwilling to act decisively. He saw the same pattern in 1860 but couldn't imagine that decisive action might prevent it. His Dickinson training taught him to analyze precedent. It didn't teach him that unprecedented crises require unprecedented responses. Buchanan's legacy as one of America's worst presidents stems directly from his educational formation. He graduated from Dickinson believing that studied neutrality was wisdom, that constitutional interpretation could resolve political conflicts, that educated men should rise above partisan passion. His presidency proved those assumptions false. By the time he left office in March 1861, 7 states had seceded, federal forts had been seized, and civil war was inevitable. His education had taught him how to think about problems. It hadn't taught him how to act despite uncertainty, how to lead when legal frameworks collapsed, how to choose sides when moderation meant complicity. The college degree marked him as educated. His presidency marked education's limits when moral courage was required. By 1861, when Abraham Lincoln took office, the educational requirements for the presidency had become so fluid that a man with approximately 18 months of formal schooling could win the office and prove more effective than his college-educated predecessors. Lincoln's education consisted of brief periods in frontier schools where he learned basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. His family moved frequently across Kentucky and Indiana, following his father's failed farms, and formal schooling stopped when Lincoln was 15. Everything afterward was self-education, borrowed books, memorized passages, grammar studied by firelight, law learned through Blackstone's commentaries and courtroom observation. He was admitted to the Illinois bar in 1836 without ever attending law school, simply by demonstrating competency to a judge. Lincoln's self-education created a mind fundamentally different from college-trained presidents. He hadn't absorbed institutional assumptions about how politics worked, hadn't been taught constitutional theory in seminars, hadn't learned that certain arguments were respectable while others weren't. His legal training came from reading actual cases and representing actual clients: farmers, merchants, railroad companies, people whose problems required practical solutions, not theoretical elegance. When he debated Stephen Douglas in 1858, Lincoln's arguments were logical, clear, rooted in basic moral premises that anyone could follow. Douglas had formal education, sophisticated constitutional theories, complex arguments about popular sovereignty. Lincoln had clarity. Slavery was wrong, the Union must be preserved. Democracy meant government of, by, and for the people. Self-education taught him to speak plainly because he'd never learned to hide behind academic complexity. The gap between Lincoln's minimal formal education and his presidential effectiveness remains one of American history's great mysteries. He preserved the Union, ended slavery, redefined federal power, and wrote speeches that became sacred texts, all with less formal schooling than most modern high school students. His education came from reading, voraciously, obsessively, everything he could find. Shakespeare gave him understanding of human nature. Euclid's geometry taught him logical proof. The Bible gave him moral vocabulary and rhetorical power. Newspapers taught him politics. Law practice taught him negotiation. The education was broad but unsystematic, deep but unstructured. It prepared him perfectly for a presidency that required moral clarity rather than institutional knowledge, plain speaking rather than classical illusions. Lincoln's self-taught background became both asset and liability. His lack of military education nearly lost the war. He cycled through generals, made strategic mistakes, took years to understand that modern war required total commitment rather than gentlemanly restraint. His lack of formal political science training made him awkward in social situations, prone to depression, uncertain about protocol. But that same outsider status freed him from conventional thinking. College-educated leaders might have sought compromise with the Confederacy because institutional training teaches that reasonable men can always negotiate. Lincoln's self-education taught him that some conflicts can't be negotiated because the underlying questions, human bondage, national survival, don't permit splitting differences. The lack of formal credentials meant he had no investment in preserving the system that credentials defended. He could reimagine everything, which is exactly what the Civil War required. By 1865, when Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln's assassination, the office passed to a man with literally zero formal education, the only president who never attended school at any level. Johnson grew up in extreme poverty in Raleigh, North Carolina, apprenticed to a tailor at age 10, and remained functionally illiterate until his late teens. His wife, Eliza McCardle, taught him to write and improved his reading after they married in 1827. Everything Johnson knew about law, politics, and governance he learned through observation and self-study, without even the frontier schooling that Lincoln had received. His rise from illiteracy to the presidency should have been an inspiring story of American opportunity. Instead, it became a case study in how lack of education, combined with resentment and prejudice, can produce catastrophically bad leadership. Johnson's complete absence of formal education shaped his presidency's racism in ways that college training might have tempered. He had no classical education teaching that different civilizations produced complex systems of thought. He had no moral philosophy coursework exposing him to Enlightenment arguments about universal human dignity. He had no historical training showing how slavery corrupted everything it touched. What he had was direct experience of poor white Southern life, where enslaved black people represented both economic competition and the only group poorer than himself. His lack of education left those prejudices unchallenged by any broader framework. When he became president during Reconstruction, his opposition to black civil rights wasn't based on constitutional theory or political philosophy. He simply didn't believe black Americans were capable of citizenship. The absence of any educational foundation destroyed Johnson's ability to navigate Reconstruction's constitutional complexities. He fought with Congress constantly, vetoing bill after bill designed to protect freed slaves and reconstruct Southern states. His vetoes weren't based on sophisticated constitutional interpretation. He had no legal training to offer sophisticated analysis. They were based on gut-level conviction that white supremacy was natural law. Congress overrode his vetoes repeatedly, passing the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction Acts without his support. In February 1868, the House impeached him for violating the Tenure of Office Act, making him the first president impeached. He survived Senate removal by one vote. His lack of education hadn't prevented him from reaching the presidency, but it left him completely unprepared to lead during a period requiring both constitutional expertise and moral vision. Johnson's post-impeachment career showed education's absence in stark relief. He returned to Tennessee and was eventually elected to the Senate in 1875, the only former president to serve in the Senate afterward. There, he continued arguing against Reconstruction, against black civil rights, against everything the Civil War had supposedly settled. His Senate speeches were crude, lacking the rhetorical polish or historical references that educated senators used. He died shortly after taking his Senate seat, still bitter about his presidency, still convinced that Reconstruction was a mistake. His lack of formal education had made him the most authentically self-made president in history. It also made him incapable of seeing beyond his own limited experience, of learning from history he'd never studied, of growing morally without frameworks that education might have provided. The self-made man had made himself into a bigot with presidential power. By 1869, when Ulysses S. Grant entered the presidency, military education's role in presidential preparation came into sharp focus. Grant had attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, graduating in 1843, 21st, in a class of 39. West Point wasn't traditional college. It emphasized engineering, mathematics, tactics, and discipline, rather than liberal arts or political philosophy. Grant was an indifferent student, accumulating demerits for unmilitary bearing and showing talent mainly in mathematics and horsemanship. The academy taught him how to organize supply lines, read terrain, and manage troops. It didn't teach him how to read political terrain, manage a cabinet, or recognize corruption in subordinates. Grant's military education served him brilliantly as commanding general during the Civil War, and catastrophically as president. West Point taught systematic thinking, define the objective, assess resources, develop strategy, execute relentlessly. Grant applied this to warfare perfectly. His objective was destroying Confederate armies. His strategy was sustain pressure across multiple fronts. His execution was relentless despite horrific casualties. As president, he tried applying the same approach to domestic policy and foreign relations, with disastrous results. Politics doesn't have clear objectives like capture Richmond. Corruption investigations aren't planned like military campaigns. Grant surrounded himself with staff he trusted, just as he'd done in the Army, but trusted subordinates who were stealing millions from the federal government. His military education taught him organizational hierarchy and loyalty. It didn't teach him that civilian loyalty was different, that political appointees required scrutiny, that trust should be verified. The gap between Grant's military credentials and presidential effectiveness shows most clearly in the scandals that defined his administration. The whiskey ring, the Credit Mobilier scandal, the Black Friday gold speculation scheme. Grant wasn't personally corrupt, but his administration was riddled with corruption because his West Point training left him unprepared for civilian governance. Military education taught him that once you appointed competent officers, you trusted them to execute their duties. Civilian government required constant oversight because financial incentives created different motivations than military duty. His private secretary, Orville Babcock, was implicated in the whiskey ring, a conspiracy to defraud the government of tax revenue from whiskey sales. Grant defended Babcock, testified on his behalf, couldn't believe that his trusted aide would betray him. The military loyalty that made him an effective general made him a naive president. Grant's post-presidential reputation underwent revision, but his educational limitations remain clear. His memoirs, written while dying of throat cancer to provide for his family, are considered among the finest military autobiographies ever written. Clear, honest, strategically insightful. But they reveal the narrowness of military education. Grant could explain why he crossed the Rapidan where he did, why he besieged Vicksburg the way he did, why he accepted Lee's surrender on generous terms. He couldn't explain why he failed to recognize corruption in his administration, why his political judgments were so poor, why military success didn't translate to civilian leadership. West Point taught him to win battles. It didn't teach him that political battles require different weapons, different strategies, different definitions of victory. By 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes took office after one of the most disputed elections in American history, educational credentials had returned to prominence. Hayes graduated from Kenyon College in Ohio in 1842, then Harvard Law School in 1845, giving him both liberal arts foundation and elite legal training. Kenyon taught him classical languages, rhetoric, and moral philosophy, the traditional education designed to produce civic leaders. Harvard taught him legal theory, constitutional doctrine, and professional networks. The combination positioned him perfectly for Gilded Age politics, where educated respectability masked brutal power arrangements. Hayes Kenyon plus Harvard education enabled the corruption that brought him to power. The 1876 election was contested. Democrat Samuel Tilden won the popular vote and led in electoral votes, but 20 electoral votes from southern states were disputed. A special electoral commission awarded all 20 disputed votes to Hayes in a backroom deal. Hayes would become president, and in exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Hayes's legal training let him frame this as constitutional process rather than political theft. The Constitution didn't specify how to resolve disputed electoral votes, so the commission's decision was technically legal. His Harvard education taught him how to make corrupt bargains sound like procedural regularity. The Compromise of 1877 was dressed in legal language, but it was theft. Hayes stole the presidency and traded black civil rights for white Southern acceptance of his authority. The contradiction between Hayes's impressive educational credentials and his presidential moral failure reveals how education can legitimate injustice. He'd studied at two of America's most respected institutions, absorbed their teachings about law and ethics, graduated with honors. Then he presided over the abandonment of freed slaves to white supremacist terror, calling it reconciliation. His Kenyon moral philosophy training should have taught him that reconciliation without justice is capitulation. His Harvard law training should have taught him that legal procedures can be used to achieve illegal ends. Instead, both educations gave him vocabulary to justify what he was doing. When he announced he wouldn't seek re-election in 1880, he framed it as a principled decision. It was actually recognition that he'd betrayed everything his education supposedly taught him to value. Hayes spent his post-presidential years on educational reform and humanitarian causes, as if trying to atone for his presidential failure. He supported black education in the South, promoted civil service reform, advocated for prison reform. The irony is bitter. The education he'd received enabled him to destroy Reconstruction, then bothered him enough afterward that he spent decades supporting the people his presidency had betrayed. His Kenyon plus Harvard credentials were supposed to prepare moral leaders. Instead, they prepared a man who knew what was right, had the education to recognize betrayal when he committed it, and did it anyway because political survival required it. By 1881, when James A. Garfield took office, scholarly credentials reached new heights. Garfield had graduated from Williams College in Massachusetts in 1856, where he'd studied classical languages with such dedication that he could simultaneously write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other, a party trick that impressed educated audiences. Williams taught him ancient literature, philosophy, and rhetoric in the classical tradition. After Williams, he studied law while teaching and eventually serving in the Ohio Senate. Unlike most lawyer presidents, Garfield was genuinely scholarly. He read constantly, engaged with complex ideas, approached problems through intellectual frameworks rather than just political calculation. Garfield's Williams education created expectations his presidency never had time to meet. He entered office in March 1881, planning civil service reform and reconciliation between Republican factions. His classical training had taught him that educated leadership could overcome partisan divisions, that rational argument could convince opponents, that philosophical principles could guide political action. On July 2nd, 1881, 4 months into his presidency, Charles Guiteau, a mentally disturbed office seeker who'd been denied a patronage appointment, shot Garfield at a Washington train station. Garfield lingered for 11 weeks, dying on September 19th. His Williams education had prepared him to govern, It hadn't prepared him for the reality that patronage-based politics created violently aggrieved failures who believed assassination was legitimate political expression. The tragedy of Garfield's abbreviated presidency is that his classical education might have served the nation well if he'd survived. He understood that the patronage system, where government jobs were distributed based on political loyalty, corrupted democracy. His Williams training taught him that merit should determine position, that educated capability mattered more than partisan service. His assassination paradoxically achieved his goal. The public outrage led Congress to pass the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883, creating a merit-based system for federal employment. Garfield's education prepared him to lead reform. His death accomplished it. The gap between Garfield's scholarly credentials and his inability to prevent his assassination shows education's ultimate limitation. It can prepare you for expected challenges, but not for random violence. His Williams training taught him Greek philosophy, Roman history, rhetorical technique. It didn't teach him that in Gilded Age America, disappointed office seekers sometimes brought guns to train stations. The classical education that made him exceptional, simultaneously writing in 2 ancient languages, couldn't protect him from a mentally unstable man with a revolver. Education elevated him to the presidency. It couldn't keep him alive long enough to use what he'd learned. By 1881, when Chester Arthur became president after Garfield's death, the office passed to a man whose educational credentials were solid, but whose reputation was corrupt. Arthur had graduated from Union College in Schenectady, New York, in 1848, studying classics and law before apprenticing with a New York legal firm. Union College was respectable, not elite. It taught the standard liberal arts curriculum but lacked Harvard or Yale's prestige. Arthur then studied law and built a career in New York Republican politics, becoming famous as a master of the spoils system, the patronage-based corruption that Garfield had opposed. His Union College education had taught him classical ideals. His political career taught him that ideals didn't win elections, organization, money, and patronage did. Arthur's college training became relevant in unexpected ways during his presidency. He'd studied constitutional law at Union, understanding presidential powers and limits. When he took office, reformers expected him to continue the corrupt patronage practices he'd mastered in New York. Instead, Arthur surprised everyone by supporting civil service reform, signing the Pendleton Act in 1883 that Garfield's assassination had made politically necessary. His education gave him a framework for understanding why reform mattered, that republics couldn't survive when government positions were rewards for party loyalty rather than qualifications. His political experience taught him how deeply patronage had corrupted American governance. The Union College degree hadn't made him a reformer. Witnessing a president murdered over a patronage dispute made him realize the system had to change. The contradiction in Arthur's educational background shows in his physical transformation of the White House. Union College had taught him classical aesthetics and cultural refinement. As president, he redecorated the White House in lavish Gilded Age style, hired Louis Comfort Tiffany to design interiors, and insisted on formal dinner protocols. He became known as Gentleman Boss, a figure of fashion and taste who collected fine wines and custom-tailored suits. His education provided the cultural vocabulary for this performance, but it also revealed something darker. Arthur was dying of kidney disease throughout his presidency, and knew it. The lavish lifestyle, the cultural refinement, the insistence on aesthetic standards, these were how a Union College-educated man faced mortality, by creating beauty and order in the time remaining. He didn't seek re-election in 1884 and died 2 years later, having surprised everyone by being a better president than his political career suggested he'd be. Arthur's legacy shows how education provides tools but not character. Union College taught him law, rhetoric, and classical ideals. His political career in New York taught him how to corrupt those ideals for partisan advantage. The presidency, unexpectedly thrust upon him, forced him to choose which education to follow, the idealistic one from college or the cynical one from politics. He chose idealism, at least partly, supporting reforms that undermined the system that had elevated him. His education had always been there. It took witnessing Garfield's murder to activate it, to make him realize that what he'd learned at Union College about Republican virtue wasn't just academic theory, but survival requirement for democracy. The degree didn't change him, crisis did. But the education gave him a framework for responding to crisis with something other than self-interest. By 1885, when Grover Cleveland first took office, presidential credentials had shifted again. Cleveland had zero college education, just legal apprenticeship, marking a return to self-made credibility. Cleveland grew up in New York, dropped out of school at 16 after his father's death, and worked various jobs before apprenticing with a Buffalo law firm. He was admitted to the bar in 1859 without ever attending college or law school, relying purely on studied observation and borrowed books. This made him different from most Gilded Age leaders, who increasingly had college degrees. Cleveland's lack of formal education became a political asset. He was the honest workingman who'd pulled himself up without privilege, unlike the corrupt college-educated politicians who dominated the era. Cleveland's apprenticeship-based legal training shaped his presidency's central principle. He believed in limited government because his education had been limited, focused, practical. He'd learn law through real cases, not theoretical seminars. That made him suspicious of grand governmental schemes, skeptical of reform movements, convinced that government worked best when it did less. He vetoed more bills than any 19th century president before him, including pension bills for Civil War veterans that he considered fraudulent. His lack of formal education left him without broad historical perspective or philosophical frameworks. He saw each bill as an individual case to be judged on narrow merits, not as part of larger patterns. A college education might have taught him that governance required vision beyond case-by-case analysis. His apprenticeship taught him only to evaluate immediate details. The gap between Cleveland's limited educational background and the presidency's demands showed during his second term, which began in 1893 after he'd lost to Benjamin Harrison in 1888. Cleveland returned to office facing the panic of 1893, a devastating economic depression. His response followed his limited government training. He opposed federal intervention, believing markets would self-correct. College economics courses might have taught him about business cycles, structural unemployment, or systemic failures requiring government response. His legal apprenticeship taught him only that government shouldn't interfere in private affairs. The depression worsened, unemployment reached 20%, strikes erupted across the country. Cleveland's education hadn't prepared him to understand that economic catastrophe required more than legal procedure and limited government. Cleveland's lack of formal education ultimately defined his limitations. He was honest, hardworking, incorruptible, qualities his self-made background reinforced. But he lacked imagination, historical perspective, and willingness to experiment with solutions outside traditional frameworks. When Coxey's army, unemployed workers demanding government jobs programs, marched on Washington in 1894, Cleveland's response was to arrest them for walking on grass. His limited education left him unable to see beyond immediate law enforcement to the broader crisis of industrial capitalism. A college degree wouldn't have guaranteed better judgment, but it might have exposed him to historical examples, economic theories, or philosophical frameworks that suggested alternatives to passive observation of mass suffering. By 1889, when Benjamin Harrison entered office between Cleveland's two terms, educational credentials had returned with a vengeance. Harrison had graduated from Miami University in Ohio in 1852, studying Latin, Greek, and the sciences before reading law. Miami was a solid regional university, Presbyterian affiliated, emphasizing classical education and moral formation. Harrison then studied law in Cincinnati and built a successful legal practice in Indianapolis. His education gave him exactly what Gilded Age Republicans valued: classical training proving cultural refinement, legal expertise proving professional competency, and Presbyterian morality proving reliable character. He was the establishment candidate, the credentialed lawyer, the educated leader, everything Cleveland wasn't. Harrison's Miami education shaped his presidency's approach to federal power. He'd studied constitutional law and believed in an active federal government promoting economic development. Under his administration, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, the first federal attempt to regulate monopolies, and the McKinley Tariff, raising import duties to protect American industry. These weren't the instincts of a limited government president like Cleveland. Harrison's education taught him that government could be a tool for achieving social goals, that federal power could address problems markets created. His classical training included studying Rome's infrastructure projects, roads, aqueducts, public buildings, examples of government actively shaping society. He tried applying those lessons to industrial America with mixed results. The contradiction in Harrison's educational background appeared in his administration's corruption. Despite his Miami moral training and Presbyterian upbringing, his administration became associated with the worst excesses of Gilded Age corruption: the billion-dollar Congress that spent federal money at unprecedented rates, the pension bill scandals, the tariff debates that benefited wealthy. Industrialists. Harrison's education had taught him that government should act, but it hadn't taught him how to prevent government action from being captured by private interests. His legal training made him understand process. It didn't make him understand how process could be manipulated. The classical education gave him examples of effective government. It didn't include examples of how effective government becomes corrupt government when money infiltrates the system. Harrison's single-term presidency, losing to Cleveland in 1892 after defeating him in 1888, showed that educational credentials alone don't create electoral success. Miami University had prepared him to govern, given him intellectual frameworks and professional skills, but it hadn't taught him political charisma, common touch, or how to connect with voters experiencing economic anxiety. Cleveland, with no college degree, defeated the Miami-educated Harrison by understanding what ordinary Americans felt during the Depression. Harrison's education was superior. His political instincts were worse. The college degree signaled his qualifications. Voters decided qualification wasn't enough. By 1893, when Cleveland returned for his second non-consecutive term, he became the answer to a trivia question, the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, and proof that lack of formal education could still win elections in the Gilded Age. His second term differed from his first, mainly in the scale of challenges he faced unprepared. The Panic of 1893 became the worst economic crisis America had experienced to that point. Cleveland's response remained consistent with his apprenticeship-based training: enforce contracts, maintain the gold standard, let markets correct themselves. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, unemployment soared. Cleveland maintained his position, believing that government intervention would worsen the crisis. His limited education hadn't exposed him to alternative theories or historical examples that might have suggested different approaches. Cleveland's second term exposed how apprenticeship training, focused, practical, narrow, could be catastrophic when broader vision was required. The Pullman strike in 1894 saw Cleveland send federal troops to break the strike, arguing that maintaining mail delivery and interstate commerce required military force. His legal training taught him that contracts were sacred, that law enforcement maintained order. It didn't teach him about labor relations, economic justice, or the contradictions of industrial capitalism. College courses in economics, political philosophy, or sociology might have given him frameworks for understanding why workers struck, why inequality destabilized society, why force solved nothing. His apprenticeship taught him only that law must be enforced, regardless of context or consequence. The lasting impact of Cleveland's limited education shows in his post-presidential reputation. He remains respected for honesty and integrity, qualities his self-made background reinforced, but criticized for rigidity and failure to address Gilded Age problems. His lack of formal education made him unable to imagine alternatives to the limited government principles he'd absorbed through legal apprenticeship. When progressives later pushed for reforms, labor protections, antitrust enforcement, financial regulation, they were explicitly rejecting Cleveland's approach. His education had been sufficient for becoming president, but insufficient for adapting to changing economic and social realities. The self-made lawyer could follow precedent brilliantly. He couldn't see when precedent had become inadequate for new problems. By 1900, when William McKinley won re-election, the presidency was transitioning toward requiring credentials that signaled international sophistication, though McKinley himself represented an earlier era. He'd attended Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, but dropped out after one semester due to financial difficulties and poor health in 1860. He never returned to college, instead teaching briefly before enlisting in the Union Army. After the Civil War, he studied law at Albany Law School in New York, completing the curriculum in 1867 before being admitted to the Ohio bar. His educational path was patchwork, some college, some law school, much practical experience, typical for ambitious men of modest means in the post-Civil War era. McKinley's incomplete college education shaped his presidency's approach to American expansion. He'd lacked the classical training that taught men like John Quincy Adams how empires functioned, the historical perspective that might have warned against imperial overreach. When the Spanish-American War erupted in 1898, McKinley's limited educational background left him without frameworks for understanding colonial administration. He famously claimed he couldn't locate the Philippines on a map before deciding to annex them, a confession that revealed both his honesty and his geographical ignorance. His Albany law training taught him legal procedure. It didn't teach him the complexities of governing distant territories with different cultures, languages, and political traditions. America became an imperial power under a president whose education hadn't prepared him for empire. The gap between McKinley's limited educational credentials and the demands of global leadership showed in his reliance on advisors. He surrounded himself with better educated men, John Hay as Secretary of State, Elihu Root as Secretary of War, who had the classical training and international experience he lacked. His law school education taught him enough to know what he didn't know, which made him willing to delegate. When he was assassinated in September 1901 by anarchist Leon Czolgosz, the presidency passed to Theodore Roosevelt, whose educational pedigree was everything McKinley's wasn't. The contrast marked a turning point. The self-made politician gave way to the Harvard man, signaling that America's new global role would require credentials that matched its ambitions. By 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt became president after McKinley's assassination, Ivy League credentials returned to the White House with unprecedented energy. Roosevelt graduated from Harvard in 1880, studied history and natural sciences, graduated magna cum laude, and seemed to absorb everything the university offered. Then he attended Columbia Law School but dropped out after realizing he found law tedious and politics exhilarating. The Harvard degree gave him social credibility and intellectual confidence. The Columbia dropout proved he didn't need credentials he found irrelevant. Roosevelt's education was about networks and cultural capital more than specific training. Harvard connected him to America's ruling class and gave him the confidence to believe he belonged there. Roosevelt's Harvard education shaped his presidency's progressive agenda in complicated ways. He'd studied natural science, which gave him genuine passion for conservation. He created 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests during his presidency. The scientific training made him understand ecology before most Americans had heard the term. But his Harvard education also taught him social Darwinism, the belief that Anglo-Saxon civilization represented human evolution's peak. This produced a president who protected wilderness while believing non-white peoples were inherently inferior, who fought corporate monopolies while endorsing American imperialism in the Philippines and Latin America. The education gave him analytical tools. It didn't give him moral consistency. The contradiction in Roosevelt's educational background shows in his square-deal domestic policies versus his foreign policy. Harvard had exposed him to progressive ideas about regulating capitalism, protecting workers, and constraining corporate power. As president, he broke up trusts, supported labor rights, and regulated food and drug industries. That was his Harvard progressivism. But his foreign policy, the Roosevelt corollary declaring American police power over Latin America, the Panama Canal acquired through supporting Panamanian independence, reflected Harvard's imperial assumptions. His education taught him that educated elites should manage both domestic reform and foreign intervention. The fact that these seemed contradictory to later generations didn't trouble Roosevelt. Harvard had taught him that Anglo-Saxon leadership could simultaneously civilize at home and dominate abroad. By 1909, when William Howard Taft entered office, presidential credentials reached new heights of establishment respectability. Taft graduated from Yale in 1878, then Cincinnati Law School in 1880, giving him both Ivy League pedigree and legal expertise. Yale trained him in classics and rhetoric. Cincinnati taught him law, but Taft's real education came from his family. His father had been Secretary of War and Attorney General, providing inside knowledge of how Washington worked. The Yale degree opened doors. Family connections showed him which doors led to power. Taft became a federal judge, then Governor General of the Philippines, then Secretary of War under Roosevelt before winning the presidency. His credentials were impeccable, his preparation thorough, his capability unquestioned. Taft's Yale plus Cincinnati education created an unexpected problem. He was too judicial for politics. Law school taught him to evaluate cases objectively, consider precedent carefully, and reach decisions based on legal merit rather than political expedience. Yale trained him in systematic thinking and administrative competence. These made him an excellent judge, which he later became as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His true calling, but a terrible politician. When Roosevelt turned against him, accusing him of betraying progressive principles, Taft couldn't understand the criticism. He'd followed legal procedures, maintained constitutional boundaries, and acted judiciously. His education taught him those were presidential virtues. Politics taught him that betraying Theodore Roosevelt was political suicide, regardless of legal merit. The gap between Taft's educational preparation and political reality destroyed his presidency. His Yale training emphasized institutional respect and procedural regularity. He genuinely believed that following proper legal channels would produce good outcomes. When progressive Republicans demanded aggressive trust-busting and labor reforms, Taft moved cautiously, citing legal limitations and constitutional constraints. His Cincinnati law education made him see legal complications where Roosevelt saw political opportunities. The Republican Party split in 1912, with Roosevelt running as a third-party candidate. Taft finished third in the election, behind both Roosevelt and Democrat Woodrow Wilson. His Yale-Cincinnati credentials had prepared him perfectly for the judiciary, where legal analysis matters. They'd prepared him poorly for a presidency requiring political instinct, charisma, and willingness to bend rules that lawyers like Taft believed sacred. By 1913, when Woodrow Wilson entered the White House, the scholarly president had returned, but this time with credentials that exceeded even John Quincy Adams. Wilson held a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins, earned in 1886 with a dissertation on congressional government that academics still reference. He'd graduated from Princeton in 1879, studied law at the University of Virginia, practiced briefly before returning to graduate school. Then he taught at Bryn Mawr, Wesleyan, and Princeton before becoming Princeton's president in 1902. His academic credentials were unmatched in presidential history. The only president with a doctorate, a university president, a published scholar whose books shaped how Americans understood their political system. Wilson's Ph.D. shaped his presidency's greatest strengths and worst failures. His academic training taught him systematic thinking, how to analyze complex problems, develop comprehensive solutions, and present them persuasively. This produced brilliant achievements like the Federal Reserve Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. But his scholarly background also created dangerous blind spots. He'd studied political systems theoretically, not practiced politics practically. When World War I ended and he traveled to Paris for peace negotiations, his academic idealism collided with European realpolitik. His 14 points sounded magnificent in lectures. They collapsed under pressure from leaders who wanted territory, reparations, and revenge. Lloyd George and Clemenceau weren't impressed by professorial arguments. They'd sent millions to die and wanted compensation, not philosophy. The contradiction in Wilson's educational achievement reveals itself most clearly in his racism. Johns Hopkins had taught him political science. It hadn't challenged his Virginia-bred white supremacy. As president, he segregated federal agencies that had been integrated since Reconstruction, hosted a White House screening of Birth of a Nation, a film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, and defended segregation using academic language about scientific racial differences. His PhD gave him sophisticated vocabulary for justifying prejudice. When he suffered a massive stroke in October 1919, his wife Edith essentially ran the executive branch for 17 months. The most educated president in history ended his term as a hidden invalid, while his wife made decisions his doctorate couldn't help him make. Academic credentials had prepared him to theorize about governance. They hadn't prepared him for the presidency's human realities, negotiating with cynical allies, managing his own health, or recognizing that formal education could coexist with profound moral failure. By 1921, when Warren G. Harding took office, presidential credentials swung back toward accessible mediocrity. Harding attended Ohio Central College, a small liberal arts school in Iberia, Ohio, graduating in 1882 with a degree in nothing particularly distinguished. Ohio Central wasn't selective, wasn't prestigious, wasn't particularly rigorous. It was where small-town Ohio boys went if their families could afford modest tuition. Harding studied journalism, rhetoric, and basic sciences, but mostly he socialized, played in the college band, and edited the school newspaper. The education was adequate for producing a small-town newspaper editor, which was exactly what Harding became after graduation. It wasn't preparation for presidential leadership, which became obvious almost immediately. Harding's Ohio Central education left him completely unprepared for the presidency's demands. He'd learned enough rhetoric to deliver speeches that sounded impressive without meaning much. He called it bloviating, and enough about journalism to understand how newspapers worked. But he lacked the intellectual framework for understanding complex policy, the historical knowledge for learning from precedent, or the judgment for recognizing competence versus corruption in subordinates. His cabinet included capable men like Herbert Hoover and Charles Evans Hughes, but also catastrophically corrupt figures like Interior Secretary Albert Fall, who sold government oil reserves in the Teapot Dome scandal. Harding's limited education left him unable to distinguish between the two, or perhaps unwilling to look too closely at arrangements that benefited him politically. The gap between Harding's minimal credentials and the presidency's requirements became obvious in his personal life. He conducted an affair in White House closets, wrote embarrassingly intimate letters to his mistress that later became public, and drank illegal alcohol during Prohibition in the White House. His Ohio Central education hadn't taught him discretion, judgment, or basic sense of appropriate behavior. When he died suddenly in August 1923, possibly from a heart attack, possibly from stroke, possibly from poisoning by his wife who'd learned of his affairs, the emerging scandals of his administration were just beginning to surface. His educational credentials had been adequate for small-town success. They'd been catastrophically inadequate for presidential responsibility. Ohio Central College produced a friendly, personable, limited man who should never have gotten near the White House. By 1923, when Calvin Coolidge succeeded Harding, New England respectability returned with Amherst College credentials. Coolidge graduated from Amherst in Massachusetts in 1895, studying classics, philosophy, and rhetoric in the traditional liberal arts curriculum. Amherst was prestigious but not quite Ivy League. It taught classical education seriously, but lacked Harvard or Yale's social networks. Coolidge then studied law through apprenticeship rather than law school, reading law in a Northampton, Massachusetts, office before passing the bar in 1897. His education combined classical training with practical legal work, the respectable path for ambitious New England men without family wealth. Coolidge's Amherst education shaped his presidency's defining characteristic, silence. He'd studied classical philosophy, including Stoicism, which taught that wise men speak little and act deliberately. As president, he became famous for terseness, silent Cal, who supposedly slept 11 hours a day and spoke even less when awake. His limited remarks weren't from lack of education, they were his educational philosophy and practice. Amherst had taught him that words should be carefully chosen, that silence was strength, that restraint demonstrated wisdom. This worked politically. His taciturn style seemed refreshingly honest after Harding's bloviating corruption. But it also meant Coolidge governed passively during the 1920s economic boom, believing markets should regulate themselves without government interference. The contradiction in Coolidge's educational background shows in his relationship to the economy. Amherst taught him classical economics, laissez-faire, limited government, trust in markets' self-correcting mechanisms. He applied these principles religiously, opposing regulation, cutting taxes, reducing government spending. The business of America is business, he declared, articulating his Amherst-learned philosophy. The economy boomed during his presidency, seeming to validate his classical education. Then he left office in March 1929, 7 months before the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. His Amherst training taught him theory that worked beautifully, until it didn't. The classical education gave him confidence in principles that were about to be catastrophically disproven. But Coolidge never acknowledged error. Stoic philosophy, learned at Amherst, taught that wise men don't apologize or explain, they simply endure. By 1929, when Herbert Hoover entered office, presidential credentials had evolved toward technocratic expertise. Hoover graduated from Stanford University in 1895 with a geology degree, part of Stanford's first graduating class. This made him the first president from a West Coast university and the first with technical rather than classical education. Stanford taught him engineering, scientific method, and systematic problem solving, training that made him spectacularly successful as a mining engineer, working worldwide and becoming a millionaire before 40. His education was practical, modern, focused on solving concrete problems through applied science. This worked brilliantly in business and humanitarian work. It failed catastrophically in politics. Hoover's Stanford engineering education shaped his response to the Great Depression in ways that destroyed his presidency. Engineers solve problems by analyzing data, identifying root causes, and implementing systematic solutions. Hoover applied this approach to the economic collapse that began in October 1929. He gathered statistics, consulted experts, created commissions to study the problem. His education taught him that careful analysis produced correct solutions. But economic depression wasn't an engineering problem with technical solutions. It required political leadership, willingness to experiment, and human empathy for mass suffering. Hoover's Stanford training left him convinced that markets would self-correct if government avoided interference, a theory that engineering success had taught him to trust. As unemployment reached 25% and breadlines stretched around blocks, Hoover maintained his position. Government intervention would worsen the crisis by disrupting natural economic recovery. The gap between Hoover's impressive technical credentials and his political failure reveals education's limitations in crisis. Stanford taught him how to build dams, manage complex projects, and solve logistical problems. He'd fed millions as head of food relief after World War I, demonstrating organizational genius. But depression required different skills, inspiring hope, communicating empathy, embracing radical experiments when traditional approaches failed. His engineering education taught systematic thinking. It didn't teach political flexibility. When he lost to Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, it marked the defeat of technocratic expertise by aristocratic charisma. Hoover's Stanford degree proved that technical education alone couldn't prepare presidents for challenges requiring human connection rather than scientific solutions. By 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took office, Ivy League credentials returned, but with an ironic twist. Efter attended Harvard, graduating in 1904, then Columbia Law School, which he attended but never completed. He passed the New York bar exam without finishing his degree, deciding the credential wasn't worth the bother since he'd already absorbed what he needed. This casual dismissal of formal credentials revealed Efter's confidence. His family name and Harvard connections mattered more than a law degree. His education was about social networks, not technical expertise. Harvard taught him who mattered in American society. Columbia's incompleteness showed he knew formal credentials meant less than inherited status. Roosevelt's Harvard without Columbia degree education shaped his presidency's experimental approach. He hadn't been trained in systematic theory or rigid methodology. His education was broad, social, and flexible. When the Depression required unprecedented federal intervention, Efter's incomplete legal training became an asset. He wasn't bound by strict constructionist constitutional theories that law school would have emphasized. His Harvard education taught him that rules were made by people like him and could be changed by people like him. This produced the New Deal, an explosion of federal programs that transformed American government without theoretical consistency. Social Security, the SEC, the FDIC, the TVA. These weren't products of systematic planning, but experimental responses to crisis. The approach of a man whose education taught him confidence to try things rather than frameworks that limited action. The contradiction in Roosevelt's educational background shows in his court-packing plan of 1937. After the Supreme Court struck down several New Deal programs, Efter proposed adding justices to create a pro-New Deal majority. His incomplete legal education hadn't taught him proper respect for judicial independence, or perhaps it had taught him that institutional respect was less important than political results. The plan failed politically, damaging his presidency even as the court began upholding New Deal legislation anyway. A complete Columbia legal education might have taught him constitutional boundaries that aristocratic Harvard hadn't emphasized. Then again, a complete legal education might have prevented the experimental boldness that the Depression required. Roosevelt's incomplete credentials matched his incomplete respect for traditional limitations. Both became assets during crisis requiring untraditional solutions. By 1945, when Harry Truman became president after Roosevelt's death, the office passed to a man with 0 four-year college degree, the last president without one. Truman attended Kansas City Law School at night in the early 1920s, but never completed a degree, dropping out when his haberdashery business failed. Before that, he'd briefly attended a business college. His formal education was fragmentary, incomplete, cobbled together between farm work, military service, and failed businesses. This made him radically different from the Ivy League presidents who preceded him. No Harvard, no Yale, no Princeton, no college degree of any kind. He was, in educational terms, a throwback to Andrew Johnson, the only other president in the 20th century without a four-year degree. Truman's lack of formal education became both his burden and his advantage during his presidency. Without college training, he developed a reading habit that compensated. He claimed to have read every book in his hometown library, focusing on military history and biography. This self-education gave him historical perspective that formal schooling might have provided, but without the theoretical frameworks that sometimes limited college-trained presidents. When he had to decide whether to use atomic weapons against Japan in August 1945, his lack of formal education meant he approached the decision without academic theories about warfare, international relations, or ethics. He evaluated it practically. Would it end the war faster? Save American lives? Demonstrate American power? The decision haunted him afterward. But his limited education meant he didn't second-guess himself with theoretical complications. He decided, took responsibility, and moved forward. The gap between Truman's absent credentials and his presidential effectiveness remains one of history's puzzles. He implemented the Marshall Plan, created NATO, desegregated the military, and contained Soviet expansion. Decisions requiring sophisticated understanding of geopolitics, economics, and strategy. His lack of college education didn't prevent these achievements. Arguably, it enabled them by freeing him from academic certainties that might have counseled caution. When he fired General Douglas MacArthur in April 1951 for insubordination during the Korean War, it demonstrated that formal education didn't determine command authority. MacArthur had West Point, Truman had high school. The president without a degree fired the general with elite credentials, asserting civilian control over military decisions. Truman's limited education became proof that leadership didn't require credentials, just judgment, courage, and willingness to accept consequences. He remains the last president to prove that point, making him either democracy's final victory over credentialism or the last vestige of an earlier era before credentials became mandatory. By 1953, when Dwight Eisenhower took office, military credentials had evolved into a specific kind of presidential preparation. Eisenhower graduated from West Point in 1915, 61st in a class of 164, middle of his class, distinguished mainly by demerits for minor infractions. West Point taught him engineering, military tactics, and organizational management, not political theory or constitutional law. His real education came from managing the Allied invasion of Europe during World War II, where he learned coalition politics, strategic planning under uncertainty, and how to balance competing egos and national interests. That military diplomatic experience prepared him for the presidency more than anything West Point taught him. Eisenhower's West Point training shaped his presidency's organization-focused approach. He structured the executive branch like a military command, with clear hierarchies, staff systems, and delegated authority. His education taught him that large organizations required systematic processes, intelligence gathering, strategic planning, operational execution, after-action review. As president, he applied these frameworks to everything from economic policy to foreign affairs. The National Security Council became formalized under his administration, operating with military-style briefings and decision protocols. His West Point training emphasized preparation and process. He believed that proper organization produced good decisions almost automatically. The gap between Eisenhower's military education and civilian governance showed most clearly in his reluctance to engage publicly on civil rights. West Point had taught him organizational management and strategic planning. It hadn't taught him moral leadership on domestic social issues. When the Supreme Court ruled on Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, requiring school desegregation, Eisenhower's response was tepid. He privately disagreed with the decision, believing integration should happen gradually rather than through federal mandate. His military training taught him that successful operations required preparation and planning. Forced integration seemed like poor planning to him. Only when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus defied federal court orders in 1957 did Eisenhower send troops to Little Rock. Not because his education taught him integration was morally right, but because his military training taught him that federal authority couldn't be defied without. Response: Eisenhower's West Point credentials created an ironic legacy, the military man who warned against the military-industrial complex. His farewell address in January 1961 famously cautioned that the conjunction of military establishment and defense contractors threatened democratic governance. His military education had taught him how defense systems worked, how procurement decisions were made, how institutional incentives corrupted judgment. He understood from inside experience that military credentials didn't prevent, and sometimes enabled, the corruption he was warning against. West Point gave him the organizational knowledge to recognize the problem. Leaving office gave him the freedom to name it publicly. By 1961, when John F. Kennedy took office, Ivy League credentials reached their cultural zenith. Kennedy graduated from Harvard in 1940, studying government and international relations. His senior thesis analyzed British appeasement before World War II. arguing that democracy's institutional features made it slow to respond to dictatorial threats. The thesis was published as Why England Slept, becoming a bestseller and establishing Kennedy's intellectual credentials at age 23. Harvard gave him more than education. It gave him the networks, the confidence, and the cultural vocabulary that marked him as part of America's aristocracy. His education was his identity. The Harvard man who happened to become president, not the president who happened to attend Harvard. Kennedy's Harvard education shaped his presidency's style more than its substance. He filled his administration with fellow Harvard graduates and academics, the best and brightest as they were called, bringing Ivy League intellectualism to government. Harvard had taught Kennedy that ideas mattered, that policy should be evidence-based, that intelligent analysis produced superior outcomes. This worked brilliantly in some areas. The Peace Corps reflected Harvard idealism about American leadership and soft power. But it failed catastrophically in others. The Bay of Pigs invasion showed that Harvard credentials didn't prevent spectacular misjudgment. The operation was planned by intelligent, educated men who believed their Ivy League training gave them superior insight into Cuban politics. They were completely wrong. The contradiction in Kennedy's educational background reveals itself in the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. His Harvard training in international relations taught him about balance of power, credible deterrence, and strategic signaling, theoretical frameworks that actually proved useful during the crisis. But what saved the world from nuclear war wasn't Harvard theory, it was Kennedy's willingness to ignore the advice of Harvard-educated advisors who recommended immediate military action. His education gave him the vocabulary to discuss the crisis. His judgment, shaped by experiences beyond Harvard, gave him the wisdom to find diplomatic solutions. The Harvard degree opened doors and created networks. Surviving the crisis required something education alone couldn't provide. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 meant his Harvard credentials never faced the test that destroyed Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam. The war was planned and executed by Harvard-educated advisors who believed American power and intellectual superiority could transform Southeast Asia. Kennedy's education would have given him the same frameworks, the same confidence, possibly the same catastrophic errors. His Harvard thesis argued that democracies were slow to recognize threats. His advisors used that logic to justify escalation before threats materialized. The education that made him seem sophisticated and prepared also planted the intellectual seeds for America's longest military failure. Harvard taught strategic thinking. It didn't teach humility about the limits of American power or the dangers of intellectual arrogance combined with military force. By 1963, when Lyndon Johnson became president after Kennedy's assassination, the office passed to a man whose educational credentials were distinctly un-Ivy. Johnson graduated from Southwest Texas State Teachers College in 1930, a regional school that trained public school teachers for rural Texas. It wasn't prestigious, wasn't selective, wasn't designed to produce national leaders. Johnson studied history and education, taught debate and public speaking, and learned that performance mattered more than pedigree. His college years taught him political skills, building coalitions, reading people, understanding what motivated voters that Harvard seminars rarely addressed. The Southwest Texas education was practical, democratic, accessible to poor rural students like Johnson. It prepared him for nothing except politics, which turned out to be enough. Johnson's Southwest Texas background created both insecurity and determination throughout his career. He knew he lacked the Ivy League credentials that marked Kennedy's circle as educated elites. He compensated through legislative mastery. As Senate Majority Leader, he became legendary for knowing every senator's pressure points, understanding parliamentary procedure better than Harvard-educated colleagues, and passing legislation through personal persuasion that their education couldn't match. His teaching college degree left him feeling inferior to Harvard men. So he worked harder, learned more procedure, and built power through relationships rather than credentials. When he became president, his administration was divided between Kennedy's Harvard holdovers and Johnson's Texas operatives, two different forms of education competing for influence. The gap between Johnson's limited educational prestige and his presidential achievements shows in his domestic success versus foreign policy failure. The Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights legislation, federal education funding, the war on poverty, reflected Johnson's Southwest Texas understanding of rural poverty and his teaching college belief that education could transform lives. His credentials weren't elite, but his commitment to expanding opportunity was genuine, shaped by personal experience of limited means and educational advancement. He knew what federal support could mean because he'd lived it. But Vietnam destroyed his presidency, partly because his teaching college education left him insecure around Harvard-educated advisors who assured him that American strategy was working when it wasn't. Johnson's relationship with his Southwest Texas credentials became tragic during Vietnam. He distrusted Harvard intellectuals, but couldn't challenge their strategic analyses because he felt educationally inferior. His teaching college degree hadn't prepared him to question military planning or geopolitical theories that Ivy League experts presented as sophisticated analysis. When he chose not to run for re-election in March 1968, broken by a war he couldn't win and protests he couldn't stop, it marked the defeat of practical political education by intellectual overconfidence. His Southwest Texas training taught him how to pass legislation and read voters. It didn't teach him to resist Harvard-educated advisors, whose credentials intimidated him even when their judgment was catastrophically wrong. The teaching college president achieved more domestically than most Harvard graduates could imagine. But his educational insecurity helped trap him in a war that destroyed his presidency and killed 58,000 Americans. By 1969, when Richard Nixon entered his first term, the credential requirement had solidified. Every serious presidential candidate needed at least a college degree, preferably with graduate education. Nixon had attended Whittier College in California, a small Quaker school where he excelled academically, graduating third in his class in 1934. Then Duke Law School on full scholarship, graduating third in his class in 1937. His credentials were solid, college plus elite law school, but not Ivy League for undergraduate work. That gap defined his political identity, the striver who'd earned his way up through merit rather than birth, forever resentful of the Kennedys and other Ivy League aristocrats who'd been born into privilege he'd fought to achieve. Nixon's Duke Law education shaped his presidency's darkest moments with peculiar precision. He'd studied constitutional law thoroughly, understood executive power's theoretical boundaries, knew exactly what limits the Constitution placed on presidential authority. When Watergate unraveled, what shocked legal scholars wasn't that Nixon broke laws. Presidents had done that before, but that he understood so precisely which laws he was breaking and chose to break them anyway. His Duke training taught him constitutional doctrine. His resentment taught him that rules were for people who hadn't fought as hard as he had. The education gave him legal vocabulary to describe his abuses. His character determined he'd commit them regardless. The contradiction embedded in Nixon's educational achievement reveals itself in the White House tapes. Hours of recordings demonstrate sophisticated legal reasoning, Nixon discussing executive privilege, attorney-client privilege, evidentiary standards with the precision Duke Law taught him. Then he orders the same criminal actions, believing presidential necessity overrides legal constraints. His education didn't prevent his crimes. It gave him tools to rationalize them. When he told David Frost that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal, he was articulating a theory of executive power that contradicted everything Duke Law School taught about constitutional limits. The credentials proved he could master legal theory. They couldn't prevent him from believing himself above the law he'd studied. Nixon's resignation in August 1974 marked the defeat of striving ambition by institutional limits. His Whittier plus Duke credentials had lifted him from modest origins to the presidency, but they couldn't protect him from consequences when he abused the office. The education was real, impressive, earned through genuine merit. It just didn't include the character development that might have prevented his self-destruction. His law degree proved he understood the rules. His presidency proved that understanding rules doesn't mean following them. By 1974, when Gerald Ford became president after Nixon's resignation, his credentials represented perfect establishment respectability. University of Michigan for undergraduate work, Yale Law School for his law degree. Ford played football at Michigan, center and linebacker on national championship teams, before graduating in 1935 with an economics degree. Yale Law admitted him despite modest grades because his football prowess suggested discipline and character. He graduated in 1941 in the top third of his class, proving his academic competence while maintaining the athletic identity that made him relatable to ordinary voters. The combination worked perfectly. State school sports hero plus Ivy League legal training, accessible but credentialed. Ford's Michigan plus Yale education shaped his most controversial decision, pardoning Richard Nixon in September 1974. His legal training taught him that the pardon was constitutional, presidents have absolute pardon power, and that ending Watergate's legal process would help the country move forward. He was technically correct on both points. But his education hadn't prepared him for the political fury that followed. Voters saw the pardon as corruption, proof that Yale-educated presidents protected Yale-educated criminals. Ford's approval ratings collapsed from 71% to 49% almost overnight. His legal education gave him constitutional justification. It didn't give him political instinct to anticipate the consequences. The gap between Ford's impressive credentials and his political effectiveness showed throughout his presidency. Yale Law taught him constitutional doctrine and legal reasoning. It didn't teach him how to inspire a nation traumatized by Vietnam and Watergate, how to manage stagflation's economic contradictions, or how to win election in his own right. When he lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976, it marked the defeat of establishment credentials by outsider authenticity. Ford's Michigan-Yale background was unquestionably solid. Voters wanted change, not solidity. His education proved he could master institutions. His presidency proved that mastering institutions wasn't enough when institutions had lost public trust. By 1977, when Jimmy Carter entered office, military education returned, but technical rather than martial. Carter graduated from the Naval Academy in 1946, 59th in a class of 820 midshipmen, then pursued nuclear engineering training under Admiral Hyman Rickover. Annapolis taught him engineering, discipline, and systematic problem solving. The nuclear training taught him to think in terms of technical specifications, safety protocols, and measurable outcomes. This was education for managing complex systems, nuclear reactors, submarine operations, organizational efficiency, not for inspiring democratic politics or navigating congressional opposition. Carter's engineering education shaped his presidency's defining characteristic, micromanagement based on technical analysis. Engineers solve problems through data collection, careful study, and systematic solutions. Carter applied this to everything: energy policy, Middle East peace negotiations, federal budgets, even White House tennis court schedules. His Annapolis training taught him that hard work and attention to detail produced success. He famously read every budget line item, studied policy details obsessively, believed that mastering complexity would generate good outcomes. Politics doesn't work that way. Congress didn't care about his careful analysis. Voters didn't reward his policy mastery. The education that made him an excellent engineer made him a frustrating politician. The contradiction in Carter's educational background revealed itself in his post-presidential success. After losing to Reagan in 1980, Carter applied his engineering problem solving to humanitarian work, building houses, eradicating diseases, monitoring elections, negotiating peace agreements. These projects suited his technical training perfectly. Concrete problems with measurable solutions. As president, he'd tried applying engineering approaches to political problems that required flexibility, compromise, and charisma. As former president, he found problems that actually were engineering challenges. His Annapolis education was always valuable. It just needed contexts where technical expertise mattered more than political theater. The engineering skills that hurt his presidency made his post-presidency remarkably successful. By 1981, when Ronald Reagan entered office, educational credentials took an unexpected turn. Reagan graduated from Eureka College in Illinois in 1932 with a degree in economics and sociology. Eureka was tiny, Church of Christ affiliated, academically undistinguished, exactly the kind of small regional college that shouldn't have produced presidents in an era of credential inflation. Reagan studied economics without distinction, played football, worked as a lifeguard, and acted in college theater. The education was generic, the school was obscure, and none of it seemed to matter. Reagan proved that in the television age, performance skills trumped educational prestige. His Eureka degree was a credential that checked a box. His real education came from Hollywood, where he learned to perform authority rather than possess it. Reagan's Eureka education shaped his presidency through what it lacked rather than what it provided. He hadn't absorbed economic theory deeply at Eureka. His understanding remained simple. Even simplistic, lower taxes, smaller government, free markets solve problems. Academic economists tried explaining that his policies would explode deficits. Reagan ignored them, trusting his undergraduate-level understanding over their sophisticated analyses. His limited education became an asset because it freed him from complexity. Harvard-educated advisors presented complicated arguments. Reagan responded with simple stories that voters understood. The Eureka degree proved he was educable. His Hollywood career proved he could communicate. That combination worked better than elite credentials combined with elite complexity. The gap between Reagan's modest educational background and his political success revealed how credentials had become disconnected from leadership effectiveness. His Eureka training hadn't prepared him for anything specific about governing. He didn't understand policy details, often confused facts during briefings, relied heavily on staff to manage actual governance. But he understood performance, could deliver speeches with emotional resonance, and projected confidence that voters found reassuring. His economics degree gave him vocabulary to discuss tax policy. His acting career gave him ability to sell it. The education was minimal. The political success was enormous. Reagan proved that credential inflation had created opportunity for candidates who could perform competence rather than possess it. By 1989, when George H.W. Bush took office, Ivy League credentials returned with perfect establishment pedigree. Bush graduated from Yale in 1948 with an economics degree after serving as a Navy pilot during World War II. Yale taught him institutional networks and cultural confidence. His family connections, Father Prescott Bush was a senator, taught him how power actually flowed. The education was less about what he learned in classrooms than who he met in secret societies like Skull and Bones. Bush's Yale degree certified him as part of America's ruling class, someone who understood unspoken codes and inherited obligations. The economics coursework was forgettable. The social education was permanent. Bush's Yale training shaped his presidency's foreign policy success and domestic policy failure. The Ivy League taught him international diplomacy, relationships with foreign leaders, the institutional frameworks that managed global affairs. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Iraq invaded Kuwait, Bush navigated both crises with skill that reflected his educational and social preparation. He understood how to build coalitions, when to use force, how to balance competing international interests. Yale hadn't taught him those specific skills, but it had taught him the confidence to trust his judgment and the networks to implement decisions. His foreign policy was establishment competence at its finest. The contradiction in Bush's educational achievement showed domestically. His Yale economics degree hadn't prepared him to understand, or perhaps to care about, ordinary Americans' economic anxieties during the 1991 recession. When he seemed amazed by a grocery store scanner during a campaign event, it revealed how his elite education had isolated him from normal life. Yale taught him to manage global affairs. It didn't teach him to connect with voters struggling economically. His read my lips, no new taxes promise, broken in 1990 when he agreed to tax increases as part of a budget deal, reflected Yale-educated pragmatism. Responsible governance sometimes required breaking campaign promises. Voters didn't care about Yale pragmatism, they cared about broken promises. His education prepared him perfectly for international leadership. It left him unable to win re-election because he couldn't perform empathy for domestic struggles. By 1993, when Bill Clinton took office, credential inflation reached new heights. Clinton had graduated from Georgetown University, earned a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and graduated from Yale Law School, a trifecta of elite education that surpassed most previous presidents. Georgetown taught him international relations. Oxford taught him that American students could hold their own among British elites. Yale Law gave him the credential and the network, plus his future wife, Hillary Rodham. His educational pedigree was impeccable, his intelligence undeniable, his preparation thorough. He was the perfect product of credential inflation, every box checked, every elite institution conquered, every academic requirement exceeded. Clinton's Georgetown, Oxford, Yale education enabled both his policy successes and personal failures. His intellectual training let him master policy details, understand complex legislative trade-offs, and communicate sophisticated ideas to ordinary voters. When he reformed welfare, passed NAFTA, and balanced the federal budget, he was applying frameworks his education provided. Georgetown taught him how international economics worked. Yale Law taught him how to translate policy into legislative language. The education gave him tools that produced genuine achievements. But it also gave him something darker: the belief that intelligent people could manage contradictions, that personal behavior and professional competence existed in separate spheres, that being smart meant rules bent differently. The contradiction in Clinton's educational achievement revealed itself during impeachment. Yale Law taught him legal precision. He could parse what sexual relations meant, argue what is means, and distinguish between criminal conduct and impeachable offenses with sophistication his education enabled. His testimony about Monica Lewinsky showed a Yale-trained mind deploying legal reasoning to avoid consequences for personal misconduct. The education gave him vocabulary to describe his behavior in ways that sounded legalistic, rather than simply dishonest. When the Senate acquitted him, it proved his Yale training was correct. Legal precision could protect him. But it also proved education's limitation. Knowing how to parse definitions doesn't make the parsing any less morally empty. His 3 elite degrees prepared him to govern and to survive scandal. They didn't prepare him to avoid the scandal through basic judgment that no education should have to teach. By 2001, when George W. Bush entered office after the Supreme Court halted Florida's recount, credential inflation had reached absurdity. Bush held both a Yale undergraduate degree and a Harvard MBA, making him theoretically the most technically qualified president for managing the executive branch as an organization. Yale admitted him through family legacy. His father and grandfather had attended, and he graduated with a C average in 1968. Harvard Business School admitted him in 1973, and he graduated in 1975 with the management credential that should have prepared him for organizational leadership. On paper, his education screamed competence: Ivy League undergraduate plus Ivy League graduate degree. His presidency would raise uncomfortable questions about what those credentials actually measured. Bush's Yale plus Harvard credentials shaped his presidency's management style and strategic failures. Harvard Business School taught him to delegate to trusted executives, focus on strategic direction rather than operational details, and frame political decisions as management choices. His cabinet meetings reportedly felt like corporate board meetings, PowerPoint presentations, clear decision points, executive consensus. The IMBA training showed in his organization, it failed spectacularly in his judgment. Harvard taught him management theory. It didn't teach him to question subordinates' claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, to pressure test assumptions before invading countries, or to recognize when trusted executives told him what he wanted to hear rather than what evidence supported. The gap between Bush's Ivy League plus IMBA credentials and his presidential disasters reveals credential inflation's dark side. Yale taught him institutional networks. Harvard taught him organizational management. Neither taught him wisdom, curiosity, or humility to question authority figures. When his administration's failures mounted, Iraq, Hurricane Katrina, the 2008 financial crisis, they didn't stem from lack of educational preparation. His Yale degree gave him political networks. His Harvard IMBA gave him management frameworks. What was missing? Judgment, intellectual curiosity, willingness to admit error, can't be taught in seminars. Bush proved that the right degrees from the right schools measure access and persistence more than capability. The credentials opened doors, they didn't provide wisdom to make good decisions once inside. By 2009, when Barack Obama entered office, educational credentials reached their symbolic peak. Obama graduated from Columbia University, then Harvard Law School, where he became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review, a position that launched him into national visibility. His Columbia plus Harvard credentials weren't just impressive, they were historic, signaling that elite institutions had opened to talent regardless of race. Harvard Law Review presidency required both academic excellence and political skill. Students elected the president, making it a competitive campaign within a school training future lawyers. Obama won by building coalitions, promising to give space to both liberal and conservative perspectives. It was perfect preparation for post-partisan politics, except post-partisan politics didn't exist. Obama's Harvard Law training shaped his presidency's greatest strengths and deepest frustrations. His constitutional law background gave him sophisticated understanding of executive power, institutional limits, and legal frameworks governing presidential action. When he expanded drone warfare, continued Guantanamo detention, and asserted executive authority over immigration, he was applying legal reasoning his Harvard education provided. The constitutional lawyer became the president who stretched constitutional boundaries while maintaining legal justification. His education taught him where lines were. His presidency taught him that lines could be redrawn with sufficient legal creativity. Harvard prepared him to understand law. The presidency taught him that understanding law didn't require following it when political necessity intervened. The contradiction in Obama's educational achievement revealed itself in his inability to translate credentials into political effectiveness. He'd studied constitutional law, taught it at the University of Chicago, understood institutional frameworks better than almost anyone who'd held the office. Then he took office during a financial crisis, facing a Republican Congress that refused to acknowledge his legitimacy regardless of his Harvard degree. His education gave him analytical tools to understand policy. It couldn't make Republicans vote for his legislation. The Harvard Law Review presidency was supposed to signal that he could bridge ideological divides. Congressional Republicans didn't care about his Harvard credentials. His education was impeccable. His political environment made that education largely irrelevant to achieving legislative goals. By 2021, when Joe Biden took office at age 78, his Delaware plus Syracuse credentials represented an earlier era before credential inflation made graduate degrees mandatory. Biden graduated from the University of Delaware, then Syracuse Law, completing his education in 1968. Solid professional preparation that was unremarkable for his generation. By 2021, those credentials looked almost quaint. No Ivy League undergraduate, no elite law school, no graduate degree beyond the JD. But Biden's 50 years in politics since graduating meant his real education came from experience rather than credentials. His Delaware-Syracuse degrees had opened doors, 5 decades in the Senate, and 8 years as vice president taught him more than any additional credentials could have provided. Biden's limited educational prestige became an asset in 2020, when voters wanted someone who seemed normal after Trump's chaos. His Syracuse law degree positioned him as competent but not elite, qualified but not condescending. When he defeated Trump, it marked a return to establishment credentials after 4 years of a president whose Wharton degree had been his only governmental qualification. Biden proved that mid-tier credentials plus extensive experience could still win, that voters sometimes valued familiarity over flash. His education was sufficient for entry, his experience was what actually mattered. The Syracuse degree was 40 years in his past. His judgment was shaped by everything since then. 45 presidents, 9 without college degrees, 1 with a PhD. And the electorate still asking the same question Washington's critics asked in 1789. Does any of it actually matter? The presidential desk remains the same physical object. Photographs on the wall change, diplomas rotate through frames. Harvard men and teaching college graduates, West Point officers and self-taught lawyers all sat in the same chair, signed the same documents, made decisions whose consequences rarely correlated with educational pedigree. Lincoln without formal schooling ended slavery. Wilson with a doctorate segregated federal agencies. The education provided vocabulary, networks, confidence. It didn't provide wisdom. Sleep well. The office doesn't require a test.